$118.7 billion. That is how much trade flows between Canada and China annually. And this morning, Mark Carney landed in Beijing to sign deals that will double that number while completely eliminating Donald Trump's ability to threaten Canadian trade ever again. 8 years since the last Canadian Prime Minister set foot in China. 8 years of frozen relations, tariff wars, and diplomatic hostility. And while Trump threatens annexation and economic warfare, Carney just walked into President Xi Jinping's office to rebuild the relationship that makes American trade leverage irrelevant forever. We are forging new partnerships around the world to transform our economy from one that has been reliant on a single trade partner to one that is stronger and more resilient to global shocks. That was Mark Carney announcing his trip to Beijing, the most significant diplomatic mission in modern Canadian history. Not routine diplomacy, strategic rebellion, and Trump just realized he has 0 cards left to play. But before we dive into this incredible story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Tonight, we're showing you exactly how Carney's secret Beijing negotiations just rewrote the rules of North American trade. Why a 240% increase in Chinese oil imports is ending American energy leverage, and what Xi Jinping promised Carney in private meetings that will transform continental commerce for generations. Let me tell you about the moment that changes everything. The 13th of January, 2025, Beijing Capital International Airport. Mark Carney's plane touches down carrying the first Canadian Prime Minister to visit China since Justin Trudeau in December 2017. 8 years of diplomatic silence, broken by the man who understands global economics better than any leader in Canadian history. The symbolism is devastating for American interests. For 8 years, Canada automatically aligned with American China policy. Canada arrested Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in 2018 at American request. China retaliated by detaining 2 Canadians for over 1,000 days. Canada imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in October 2024 following American leadership. China responded with crushing tariffs, 100% on Canadian canola oil and meal, 75.8% on canola seed, 25% on seafood and pork. The economic devastation was immediate. Saskatchewan canola exports to China collapsed to $96 million in August 2025, a 76% drop compared to the previous year. Manitoba pork producers reported $19 million in annual losses. Canadian farmers watched their second-largest market disappear overnight because Canada chose American alliance over Canadian interests. But Trump's annexation threats changed everything. When Trump started calling Canada the 51st state, threatening tariffs and suggesting economic warfare, Carney realized Canada could not depend on the United States anymore. The country needed alternatives fast, and China, the world's second-largest economy, was not just an alternative, it was the alternative that makes American threats meaningless. The groundwork was laid months ago. Carney met Xi Jinping in October 2025 at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in South Korea. That was the first formal leader-to-leader contact since 2017. And Carney described it as a turning point for Canada-China relations. Xi personally invited Carney to visit China, and today that strategic partnership officially begins. Here is what makes this Beijing visit so threatening to American interests. China is already Canada's second-largest trading partner after the United States. Total two-way merchandise trade hit $118.7 billion in 2024, with Canadian exports to China reaching $29.9 billion. But that trade represents only a fraction of its potential. Before the political freeze, before the tariff wars, before automatic American alignment, China was importing massive volumes of Canadian energy, agriculture, and resources. All of that stopped when Canada chose American demands over Canadian interests. Political tensions killed billions in trade and investment opportunities. Carney's Beijing visit is designed to restart everything Trump's pressure forced Canada to abandon. The economics are overwhelming. China needs exactly what Canada produces: oil, natural gas, critical minerals, agricultural products, timber. All the resources China requires to fuel its economy and reduce dependence on unstable suppliers in the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Canada needs what China offers: a massive market for resource exports that is not controlled by Donald Trump, a counterbalance to American economic leverage, and critically, a trading partner that does not threaten to annex Canada or call it a subordinate territory. This is not about ideology. This is about survival. Carney is pursuing what he calls strategic autonomy, and China provides the foundation for independence from Trump's chaos. The centerpiece of Carney's Beijing negotiations is a straightforward trade deal that terrifies Washington. China has made its position clear: if Canada drops the 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, China will remove all tariffs on Canadian canola, pork, and seafood. Bloomberg reported that Chinese authorities plan to discuss exactly this proposal with Carney during his visit. The trade-off is devastating for American strategy. Canada gets back access to its second-largest canola market. Prairie farmers get relief from devastating price drops that cost them hundreds of millions. Manitoba pork producers recover $19 million in annual losses. British Columbia seafood exporters can sell to China again, all markets that were sacrificed to support American-China policy. In exchange, Canada allows Chinese electric vehicles into the market, breaking from American technology restrictions and creating an alternative to American automotive dominance. Ontario Premier Doug Ford opposes this to protect local auto industry interests, but Prairie premiers are desperate for agricultural relief. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew wrote that current policy created a two-front trade war that disproportionately affects Western Canada. Carney understands the political arithmetic perfectly. Prairie agriculture employs hundreds of thousands of voters who have watched their markets disappear to support American foreign policy. The choice between protecting Ontario auto assembly and rescuing prairie farmers is obvious. Agriculture wins, and Trump loses leverage over Canadian trade policy. But the real game changer is energy, and it is already happening. Since the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion came into service in mid-2024, Canada has been exporting crude oil to Asian markets, including China, in unprecedented volumes. Canadian petroleum exports to China grew by more than 240% in the first 3 quarters of 2025. That is not a gradual increase. That is a fundamental redirection of Canadian energy away from American control. Trans Mountain can carry 590,000 barrels per Dalton Y to Canada's Pacific coast. From there, tankers ship Canadian heavy crude directly to Chinese refineries, creating energy relationships that bypass American infrastructure completely. This is exactly what Trump feared most. When Trump seized Venezuelan oil exports, he cut off China's largest heavy crude supplier. China was importing 144 million barrels annually from Venezuela before Trump redirected that supply to American refineries. Canada provided the alternative China desperately needed. Chinese refineries are now locked into Canadian supply specifications. Once refineries adjust their processing equipment to Canadian heavy crude characteristics, switching back to other suppliers becomes expensive and disruptive. This creates permanent strategic value that persists regardless of political changes in Washington or Ottawa. Canada is also exploring massive liquefied natural gas export projects targeting Asian markets, with China as the primary customer. China needs natural gas imports to reduce coal dependence and meet environmental commitments. Canada has the 4th largest natural gas reserves in the world, creating perfect supply-demand alignment that makes American energy exports less essential for both countries. These energy partnerships create what economists call path dependency. Once pipelines are built, processing facilities are adapted, and long-term supply contracts are signed, they last for decades. Carney's goal is not just immediate trade relief, it is permanent infrastructure that makes Canadian energy independent of American political interference. The strategic ambition is breathtaking. Carney wants to double Canada's non-United States exports over the next decade, growing from roughly 25 to 50% of total exports. That means restructuring the Canadian economy away from overwhelming dependence on American markets toward a diversified portfolio that includes China, Europe, India, and other major economies. Canadian exports to non-United States countries already grew substantially through 2025. The United Kingdom, European Union, China, Singapore, and Indonesia led the expansion. After Trans Mountain became operational, Crude exports to China soared beyond all projections. Canadian aerospace exports to Singapore increased 67% as companies found alternatives to American markets. The government allocated $159 million over 3 years for trade financing programs, specifically to assist Canadian firms entering new markets. This represents comprehensive trade diversification strategy, not incremental adjustment. Canada is systematically reducing American leverage by building alternatives that make Trump's threats ineffective. Chinese state media is encouraging this strategic shift. The Global Times welcomed Carney's visit as a new starting point for bilateral relations. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning said China wants to consolidate the momentum of improvement in Canada-China relations. President Xi personally invited Carney and is conducting extensive meetings during the visit. This represents strategic priority at the highest levels of Chinese leadership. From China's perspective, Canada offers something uniquely valuable, a wedge in the American alliance system. If Canada breaks from automatic Washington alignment on China policy, other American allies might follow. Australia already reset relations with China despite American objections. The United Kingdom is planning high-level visits. Canada breaking from American-China trade policy would demonstrate that Trump's aggressive approach pushes allies away rather than strengthening American leadership. For China, this also provides access to critical resources through channels not controlled by American policy. Canadian oil, natural gas, critical minerals, and agricultural products can flow to China regardless of American sanctions or trade restrictions. This reduces Chinese vulnerability to American economic warfare while giving China leverage in future negotiations with Washington. Carney understands the risks of deeper China engagement. China uses economic dependence for political leverage. China's human rights record creates moral complications. But Canada cannot afford complete dependence on Trump's America, which treats allies as subordinate territories subject to arbitrary demands. The key is strategic balance. Canada is not abandoning the United States for China. Canada is creating options that reduce vulnerability to any single partner's demands. If Canada has major trading relationships with both America and China, neither can dominate Canadian policy through economic threats. Canada is simultaneously deepening ties with Europe, India, Japan, and South Korea, creating alternatives when any partner becomes unreliable. Canada has resources the world needs: energy, critical minerals, agriculture, and technology. Building infrastructure to reach multiple markets creates negotiating leverage with all partners, including the United States. China wants to invest in Canadian infrastructure, electric vehicle plants in Ontario, port upgrades, energy processing, and transportation networks. Chinese investment finances infrastructure that makes bilateral trade more efficient while creating permanent economic relationships. Trump's aggressive approach forced this diversification. His annexation rhetoric and tariff threats left Carney no choice. The smart response was building alternatives to American market dependence. If Carney succeeds in Beijing, concrete results follow quickly. China phases out tariffs on Canadian canola, pork, and seafood. Canada reduces tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Both countries sign energy cooperation and critical minerals agreements. Chinese companies announce manufacturing investments in Canada. Canadian energy companies sign long-term Chinese supply contracts. This represents pragmatic engagement, mutual economic benefit, while maintaining security vigilance. Canada protects sensitive technologies and maintains appropriate caution, but trades with China because it serves Canadian interests and reduces American dependence. Trump will hate this Beijing reset, viewing Canada's China engagement as betrayal. Trump will threaten retaliation through tariffs or economic punishment. But this proves exactly why Canada needs Chinese alternatives. Multiple markets create options. Options create leverage. Leverage enables resistance to unreasonable demands from any partner. Canada currently has no bargaining power with Trump because it lacks alternatives. After Beijing, Canada has substantial options. Trump might retaliate, but limitations exist, because America needs Canadian energy, minerals, and agriculture as much as Canada needs American markets. Carney is calling Trump's bluff by building alternatives that prove Canada can prosper without complete dependence on American approval. This changes the entire dynamic of Canada, United States relations from subordination to partnership between equals. The Beijing visit represents more than diplomatic engagement. This is Canada declaring strategic independence after decades of automatic alignment with American foreign policy. Canada joined American wars, imposed American sanctions, and followed American trade policies without questioning whether those policies served Canadian interests. That era ended when Trump treated Canada with contempt, threatened annexation, and weaponized trade relationships. Trump destroyed the goodwill and mutual respect that made automatic alignment possible. Now Canada pursues its own interests even when those interests diverge from American preferences. China provides the test case. If Canada can normalize relations with China despite American objections, Canada can pursue independent policies on climate, trade, security, and international institutions. Canada becomes an independent actor rather than an American subordinate, fundamentally changing the balance of power in North America. The secret Beijing deal eliminates Trump's trade leverage forever because it proves Canada can thrive without American permission. The $118.7 billion relationship grows to over $200 billion within 5 years. Canadian energy flows to Chinese refineries regardless of American policy. Chinese investment builds Canadian infrastructure that serves Canadian interests. And Trump discovers that bullying allies creates exactly the alternatives to American dominance that he spent decades trying to prevent. Mark Carney landed in Beijing as a Canadian Prime Minister. He'll leave as the architect of American strategic defeat, carrying agreements that make Trump's threats as irrelevant as his annexation fantasies.